Chair. Okay. Hi guys. So POIs are welcomed. I'm Prime Minister. So if you have any clarification, you don't have to agree with definitions, it's fine. You can ask. Thank you. Sam. All right. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What do AIDS look like in the period where they are in the conversation of data collection? In terms of countries like US, even corporations that are tied to majority of countries that exist in like the IMF that constantly give loans to Africa, or even the Chinese bank that constantly give loans to African countries like Nigeria, Ghana, even Rwanda. In terms of exchange of data when it comes to this loan, monetary incentive is given in exchange of data collection for most critical sectors where those aids are being implemented. Sometimes these particular loans aids are implemented in two strategic positions. One, the collection of data is usually comes in the point that, most of these countries want to monitor how you are implementing these particular funds in terms of how it's progressing those particular sectors and how you're going to pay them back because of the aid that they are giving you to invest in those sectors. Or secondly, the data in of itself is used as a trade-off to negotiate for more discounts in terms of the level of interest that comes with the loans that is being borrowed by most of these companies. This is what this generally looks like in status quo. So the conversation should be why should we refuse this aid? What are the incentives to refuse this aid? What is the importance of refusing this aid, and what does it do to the stability of African nations at the end of the day? The first primary reasons, we think that the reason why we need, first and foremost, the reason why we need to refuse the aid that comes with data collection as a primary exchange. Notice panel that they can't claim that we get it shorted in terms of receiving of aids for other sectors or other places that need strategic positioning, because we think that most aids not all aids comes with things like data collection, because some come with economic implications of fact that you have to grow your economy exclusive of data collection. So those aids still exist on outside. The conversation is when aid comes to the idea of data collection in that particular exchange. So we need to make clarity on that. Moving over to my first justification. The reason why we need to refuse aid that comes with data collection from foreign countries is because it is counterintuitive to progress of strategic structures within African countries. Why is this true? Because we think that data that is collected within this exchange is large data in of itself that has critical and exclusive federal data on most of the conditions of those sectors. Secondly, have critical information on the progress or decline of most of those sectors of itself. And then this data in of itself is collected in a cumulative effect. That means it comes from all the sectors and branches that exist within the country. So it comes in a large spoken and scale in a particular regard. Why is it particularly important? So that this sensitive information is tied to primarily two things that affect African nations in that particular regard. One, the economic growth, and secondly, state policy in that particular regard. Why is this important? Two layers of mechanisms. We think that primarily the incentive of foreign countries that give this aid in exchange for data is not primarily to help African countries to go, it's to put them in control and check so that they can take advantage of economic declination of those particular sectors that are supposed to help in progressing African countries and improving their status within the global community. Why is it? Yeah, I'll take that POI.
In the absence of these foreign investments, what would you do to Mr. Value?
This is not foreign investment, this is aid. Moving on. Foreign countries like US and China often benefit of the underdevelopment of African nations. So such data is critical in terms of accomplishing this manipulation in two folds. First, constantly allows for dependency in terms of security assistance and also compromises local security on a sovereign level for most of these African nations, leading to lack of local legislatures to invest on how those things can be more stable to progress those nations and protect citizens. On the last impact in terms of compromise of sovereignty as a whole, I think sovereignty comes when a country of itself can be hardly sustained without collecting money constantly from individuals in terms of exchanging collection of data. And this particular culture of constantly using what you think is easy to trade off, because politicians think that data is something that they can use to keep citizens in check and also continue their lobbying power with their large hegemonious bodies who exist with other countries. This is inherently problematic. The sovereignty of those particular nations of itself to be less dependent, be more progressive, and to have more friendlier policies for their own self-development and own advances is only going to be achieved in a world where we do more progressive things, like allowing for things like accepting the fact that we need to refuse aid that comes with data collection, so that we can also put into the effect of certain things we are doing in status quo to ensure the stabilization of Africa. What have you gotten from this speech?
This data, in the absence of this, giving these guys this data, there are two things to know from that POI. Is that one, you're the one giving the data, so it means then that you also still retain the autonomy to the extent of how that data is shared as well. So it means that that level of control is one that prevents the extremities that closing government is going to try to argue, right? We then also tell you, however, that there's a principle where you have an immediate survival problem, right? And also you're looking for utilitarian good, right? Because you have millions of lives that depend panel that depend on critical health, agricultural, and economic aid. It means then that your system fails in the instance where you don't get this aid. They have to prove how that aids are still going to be given to you. But here's why that will not happen, right? The idea here is that Africa barely contributes to global development necessarily. It means that in current status quo, they don't rate us. It means they don't respect us. They feel like we're not contributing to any instance. What you do when you refuse this aid on this particular idea is that you refuse to contribute to that development and you worsen off your interactions with these countries internationally and globally in and of itself. And also what it means is that you become the first victim of those actions in and of itself because you don't have the fallbacks to protect yourself in and of itself. The data that is supposed to be used for this advancement, you cannot use it. The data that you have, you cannot utilize it for any forms of change internally. You don't get financial aid, you can't use the data you're protecting. At the very end of the day, your people die and you're a bad god. Because we are not just thinking of Africa in 50 years. We're thinking of Africa surviving now. We're thinking of the need for that immediacy of that survival necessarily. So we think to the extent where you can necessarily keep giving that data, and that data is always going to be a constant need across board. That long-term benefit that she claims doesn't happen is very existent in the context of our world because they are always going to need that, and we're always going to be willing to like create that level of exchange in and of itself, right? Also, however, we think that governments can simultaneously leverage this externally funded statistical mapping to refine their own domestic policies in and of itself. It means that when you give data, right, that data then is used to create like systems that you can then utilize in the context of your domestic policies and be able to like create better systems for your own government. It means that the export that you do not only gives you financial aid, but it gives you the ability as a government to function properly within the context like of society in and of itself, right? The resulting impact is that you have a highly efficient response framework that then maximizes the practical utility for every aid that is provided to you. The third thing then, because they need to like talk about how if they do get aid through other means, how are they even able to like maximize that aid in and of itself? In the instances where you can't manage aid, you can't maximize the data that you have in and of itself. So you have so much data, you know so much about your people, there's so much information that you have, but you can't use it. It means that the only instance where you maximize that is where you give that in exchange for things like financial aid, right? Preventing predatory like alternatives and like things like stagnation. We think then that when you reject traditional aid like that comes from these guys, you often force developing nations to accept opaque predatory loans that then entail severe economic concessions, right? And this is something that's primarily important because what then becomes the alternative then is to take loans from people like China, is to take loans from people like Russia, is to take loans from people like the US, the IMF, and all of those things, right? We think at the very end of the day, right, because you don't show what else you give these guys in exchange for you to necessarily get aid, it means that then you're going to like necessarily want to like do things like take loans, take loans, the one that we have already proven that are bad, going to end up at bad debts, and also means that these guys are going to do things that involve themselves within the context of your policies, within the context of the establishment of your government and how your government like necessarily runs in and of itself. Last thing then to note is that when you engage with like data-driven aid programs, it basically actively builds all the local technology capacity and robust infrastructure that you're supposed to create within the context of your what's it called, within the context of your state. Because like we said, you will have a technological gap. They concede to that, right? It means then the only instance where you can mitigate that gap and close that gap and allow for any forms of like improvement to happen, that's the world where you win. The ultimate impact here, right, is that you have a long-term systemic stability that allows for immediate survival and that economic collapse is prevented in the context of your world. Here.
Other can be leader blocks and disputes and by debt and
Okay, can I start? Okay, so QI from any minute. So I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. OOs claim that this is going to optimize, like, or that this is going to optimize public aid is untrue. Why? Because they don't show the level of bargaining power or the level of control African countries are going to retain within this data. Understand that what they say is that these countries can control how you distribute this data. They don't talk about how you retain control over what these countries use this data for. Great analysis to you how these people can use this data to like harm these sectors. Why do African countries lack the bargaining, like lack the power to control how these people use this data? One is that these people have like things like national interest, so it means that they don't give a fuck about you. But two is that they have an incentive to build their global hegemony, so it means that they won't even allow you to retain any form of control, given that the reason why they want to operate with you in this same deal is because they see potential in your market, so they want to use it to their advantage. These people do not give a fuck or do not care about individuals who necessarily lack advantage in that regard. But next thing they claim is that, oh, you don't like what next thing they claim is that how do you survive when these countries, like how do you survive without these aids from this country? First of all, like he analyzes how like countries in Africa are usually bad at loans. He forgets that these people are people that like have industries plus like raw materials that incentivize investors to come in there. So it means that in like absence of loans, these people are still going to survive, given that things like investors are still going to come in to invest in these places to enable them like have like a certain level of control. But notice one thing about OO. They are like all the impacts you get from OO are largely fixated on things like short term. Why? Because they say that, oh, you are going to use these things like to manufacture products and all of those type of stuff. They don't tell you how African countries most likely gain access to these products. But even if they gain access to these products, it means that it's largely going to be expensive. Why? Because like only the government most likely wants to benefit from it. They don't talk about how the poor people, how taxpayers that exist in Africa are largely going to benefit for the influx of these products into African states. So it means that they are at best, the impact you get from them is largely short term in that regard. The next thing they argue is as to what are you going to do with that data. And I think that that's very ridiculous for like a POI from Mascot. What are you going to do with that data? The problem with that POI is that even when African countries are underdeveloped and terrible, they still have an incentive to make movements that are going to develop them in that regard. So it means that they can still create partnerships with like people necessarily without giving them like without making them have access to that data. They can use that data to like create they can like create collaborations with like external companies or even countries while using that data for their own regard in order to show the extent of how like they want these people to gain control. In that way, they are more able to like control how this data is being distributed as to their world where they don't show how you gain like a level of control and all of those type of stuff. But next thing he says is that people need data to create products. And I'm unsure how he like is able to show that, oh, is it companies within Africa that need data to create products, or is it companies like Pfizer and OpenAI that need like all this data to create products? We don't get that economy or like mechanization as to who needs this data. But let's even assume that African countries need it. The only way you can be able to buy that argument is that if they're able to prove that when you want to collaborate with this data as to African countries, they're still able to like use the like African countries are still able to like use this data for their own sake without countries like US or even China hampering on them. But if you say that, oh, countries like US are going to use this data to produce products that are going to help you within this sector, they don't show how these countries are still going to get access to it, given that you don't have bargaining power in that regard because these people are more powerful than you. This already shows you how these people have an incentive to clamp on these sectors, like with the whole bombing example and all of those type of stuff. And we think that this is something that is very, very important. What OO has to show in this regard is to prove that if like what incentive do countries have to like sell out the only things that like probably keep them above par with countries, because understand that countries like US have no incentives to do things like negotiate with you. You guys can do things like exchange of resources for aid and all of those type of stuff, but US can do exchange of like data and stuff like that to you. It means that that data is probably the only stuff you have above you in terms of power. To the extent where you give these people keys to that embeddlement is very, very unfair and it clamps on you. What is the extension that it gets from us? One is as to how it harms like national plus digital sovereignty. Understand that Grace already analyzes to you as to how it harms our national sovereignty. But understand that we are in a world where digital products are thriving, right? So it means that these sectors are very key sectors in Africa and largely means of development. A lot of people in Africa are diversifying into things like tech and all of those type of stuff. So it means that they have an incentive to create means of living from that. But secondly, these big companies do things like exportation of these products, do things like Pfizer and OpenAI into Africa. The problem with this is that these countries exporting these products into your spaces is not because, oh, they want to largely make money, or oh, because they want to collaborate with you, or because they care about you. The problem is that they want to retain their national interest, they want to retain their national interest and come off top as a global hegemony. The reason why this is bad is that African countries are already largely dependent on these people for aid. So it means that when data becomes a price, it harms you because you are further getting embedded into their shackles. Because already the mere fact that you guys collaborate on things like the mere fact that you guys collaborate on things like normal loan already means that you are embedded with them because they become loan sharks to you. The moment they are able to handle your data, it means that they are more able to, or like have an incentive to cause further harm to you. So even when they talk about things like China, people like China, we still think that these people are also the same, right? What is this? What is the impact of this? It means that these people have an incentive to influence policies surrounding these sectors, say health, say technology. So it's already advertised to you as to how these people have an incentive to do things like get like local interest in like things like Nigerian elections and all of those type of stuff. It means that over time, these African countries like will be struggling to survive, given that these countries like US or even these companies want to sort of create policies that surround these places. Why? The reason why they're able to do it is because they like have control of their data. The problem with this is that you ordinarily sold that data to them. I've already analyzed how you don't have control over that data. So it means that they can't fix out that harm that is going to occur when these people make policies surrounding these sectors. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister, and welcome to the other.
I start. It is likely that the rest of the world improves the general quality of the human life without data from Africa. But they just won't optimize to do this because the overall quality of all the things necessary for global good life depends on collecting data from every single part of the world. The evaluation of those data are used in themselves to improve the general quality of living that exists in the world. The first thing I'm going to do is to talk about what exactly this data look like, because I'm unsure whether opening government understands this. That's why they make some sort of crazy, silly arguments like they do. They don't explain these anyways. These data look like things like patient records from hospitals in Africa that record diseases, treatments, or how people react to specific medicines. These things look like DNA data that is collected to
invest in things like research, into things like Ebola cure, all of them. Or they look like vaccination records or epidemiological trends in themselves that are collected for specific reasons. They also look like governance and population data, like census and demographic data, or they look like security, agricultural data in themselves that are also used in understanding the supply market chains, but more importantly, that are used in improving the quality of food globally. There are two implications of understanding what this data look like. The first is, in the vast majority of instances, these products that are optimized from these data are the ones that are ended up being imported back to African countries for usage, which means you are unable to contribute to the investment and the production of the type of services that you are likely to use in yourself. But secondly, in line with the principled claim that Nedu gives you in the ELO speech, that you are unable to be involved in global participation of data in and of themselves. The problem is not the way in which this data is probably collected. The problem is how it is regulated and managed in African societies. We think in the absence of doing things like this, we are very happy to do things like optimize the usage of this data in of themselves. Nedu already explains to you that we are likely to negotiate the terms on our ends because you're the one giving this data to them at the expense of specific aids which we say you need. The first thing I want to do is just to flip the biggest case they have. They say, we need to protect the sovereignty of these nations and to make them less dependent. I think it's unlikely that sovereignty in of itself is fringe just because you are exchanging data for specific things. I don't think African countries are so stupid to exchange compromising data on national security issues in and of themselves. So you're not trading off your sovereignty for any reason. You're not exposing your military budget or what it is you want to do in the vast majority of instances. These are data that are specific, that are needed in of themselves for like specific sectors and the optimization of these sectors exclusively. The second is the incentive that they talk about. They say, what's the incentive for these countries to give back to Africa? There's a lot of incentive. We pay for those things. We have to buy those foods from them. So that's enough incentive to bring back these things to us. Even if they don't want to give us, we think for the economic incentive that exists from getting them back, we are likely to get them in of themselves. They're unable to prove why that's enough reason to just beat all the things they talk about exclusively. First, why is this data important for global development? The first thing I want to talk about here is that data collections of this nature are important for the development of global solutions to global problems. These are not solutions to problems that the West alone witness. These are solutions to problems that we witness in Africa, that we also witness in places like Asia and Europe in and of themselves. We don't want Africa to be invincible in their contributions to global solutions. This is a principled argument independent of the pragmatic outcomes of doing this in of themselves. This is dependent on the existing analogy that they say Africa in of themselves contribute less to global development. We think when you refuse aid at the expense of data collection by foreign countries for these specific reasons, you deny your citizens that opportunity to be involved in the global solutions in of themselves. The pragmatic implications of these are twofold. One, just like my partner tells you, that you're unlikely at the end of the day, you are very likely to suffer the very consequences of refusing this aid in of themselves in two ways. First, you refuse aid which we say you need, but secondly, in and of themselves, you're unable to contribute to the development of these. So at the end of the day, the fake products and the ones that are bad are the ones imported to you exclusively. Ebube, shoot. This is important because I was going to preempt this for CG. Let's deal with this. The first thing is, this debate cannot be on the evaluation of what this aid is used to do exclusively in terms of what it translates. This is a value motion based on evaluating giving one to take one. What we say is that you should not refuse aid at the expense of data collection. We agree that in the vast majority of instances, the aid that you receive may be in financial terms in themselves are probably mismanaged in and of themselves. You don't prove on that side that when you refuse this aid, it's likely that you use it for anything. But secondly, and very, very importantly, the flip of that analogy is that you're not using that money for anything. You're not using your data for anything, and you don't want to give money out. We think it's a very, very terrible system in and of itself. But thirdly and most importantly here, we think that refusal isolates African countries. We already did explain this because we think it's important that the global economy runs on data like this, and the way in which you optimize it is what is beneficial for these states in of themselves. The last thing I want to talk about is just how African countries then can optimize for the usage of this data. Note that on their side, they have to prove what we can use this data to do. That's a burden on them because you want to refuse aid at the expense of the data that you unlikely have the system, the capacity, the technical know-how to exploit in of themselves. But the last thing and the most important thing is this data in status quo is currently being mined by many big tech companies in collaboration with many African countries. This is very important. African leaders, because of their corruption, import most of these Western guys, like the Chinese guys, to come and extract these resources in the expense of using them in of themselves. We think the corruption analogy is likely at the end on either side of the house. The interrogation of this debate is, what would you use this data to do when you decide not to use them to get certain aids that you probably would not have gotten in the vast majority of instances? Proud to oppose.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Chai. You don't need yam now. You get extension.
Yeah, just give me a second. Oh God, dude, this. I don't know why my phone they behave like this. Now because of my sharing screen, God. I need a second, huh? Yeah, so if you have a POI, you just need to raise up your hand and I'll take you. Are you ready, Sam? I'm waiting for you to set your time. Okay. So beginning in 3, 2, and 1. Handle the house. Our case is not hinged on corruption at all. But it's very critical then that you notice, like, the problem that existed in opening half. But first, we have to agree that a very beautiful debate happened in opening half. A couple of problems, however. Our opening allowed them to run with the idea that the comparative that exists in this debate is one where only local companies or like only Africans have access to this data versus a world where everyone in the world has access to this data. Notice that that's not the case. Why? For a couple of reasons. In the vast majority of instances where they predicate aid on this particular thing, the only way it makes sense for them to predicate such thing on this is that they want it exclusively for themselves. So this looks like things like IP rights and stuff like that they put around this particular idea to ensure that no other person in itself are able to like necessarily have access to this particular rights in itself. The reason why this in itself is particularly problematic in terms of them necessarily having access to this data, it looks like how a foreign company like Clay has access to African data even more than like Nigerian or African-owned companies in themselves. We think that at its core, there's a principle here in terms of if they
one side I must have it, especially since the comparative about should we allow you exclusively have it versus us exclusively having it. I think it makes more sense on the level of principle for you to owe, like for it to belong to people that pay taxes to that government, for people that data is being like collected from them, for people that it directly affects the most. We think on the level of principle it favors our side. Take the point. Yes. You can't claim that it's just IP rights of all of that. It's fine. That's the way. That's not the POI. But then understand this as well, panel. Please, this is very, very important. Africa has long Africa has long been treated as a laboratory for foreign knowledge extraction. Health systems are studied, technology adoption is monitored, and economic behaviors are meticulously recorded, often without meaningful benefits to African citizens. Aid comes with string attached, and the most dangerous string is data extraction. Today, we argue that African countries must refuse aid that requires surrendering their own data. Why? Because data is the most valuable resource of the 21st century, capable of powering economic growth, technological innovation, and national sovereignty. To understand this, consider an analogy. Data is to the 21st century what oil was to the 20th century. When foreign actors extract African oil, they refine it elsewhere and sell it back to us at a higher price, capturing almost all the value. Do not take my word for it, take his word for it. Similarly, African data is extracted, processed abroad, then sold back as refined AI models, analytics, or health solutions. Unlike oil, however, data, and this is the unique difference, is uniquely valuable at every stage. Raw data like health statistics or agricultural records have intrinsic worth. Processed data, AI models, predictive analysis, or fintech algorithms create even more value and leads to even more wealth. African countries are uniquely capable of pushing data to the finished point themselves, retaining full control and maximizing economic and strategic benefits. Notice that this is the comparative that wins the debate. Because at best, and this is the best case scenario in the world, they keep African countries as countries that consistently need aid in and of itself. They not provide to you any mechanism as to how countries are able to catapult African countries from being countries that need aid to becoming countries that are economically independent in and of themselves. The analysis that we give to you, and this is something that you lack from them, is what African countries can uniquely do with this data, and how that data in itself is critical. And we believe the very first case here is that data refusal creates unique African data that attracts investments. Understand this, refusing aid that is tied to data extraction ensures that African data remains unique and controlled locally, transforming it into a strategic asset. The mechanisms behind this are threefold. The first is that scarcity drives investment. Unique data sets attracts both local and global investors seeking insight into African populations, health systems, and markets. But two is that domestic innovation incentivizes local companies, and universities can do things like develop AI, health analytics, and fintech solutions that are tailored specifically to African context. But three is that intellectual property creation in itself, in the sense that ownership over data sets allows African firms to capture downstream value internally rather than losing it abroad. I'm not taking any more PR. I keep quiet. You have your time. The impact and importance of this is quite simple. Investment flows into African-led innovation in the sense that you now have creating of jobs, strengthening infrastructure, and generating sustainable wealth. This is structural empowerment, laying the foundation for Africa to transition from developing to developed status. But then this is the second case, and this is where it gets even sweeter. Because African companies can process data to finish products and become exporters. And this is basically where we win the debate. How so? One, by retaining and processing African data, local firms can create unique finished products, AI models, predictive analysis, health interventions, and technology solutions that are globally competitive. They fail to tell you why the cure for Ebola must always come from the West. Why must we always depend on them to necessarily get all of this? There are three mechanisms that prove this. I don't like the theatrics, please. There are three mechanisms that prove this. The first is there's local contextual expertise. In the sense that African researchers and firms understand local realities even better than foreign actors, producing more accurate and valuable finished products. But second is that there's integrated domestic innovation ecosystems. In the sense that you now have networks of startups, universities, and research institutions that form complete pipelines to convert raw data into actionable products. But three is that you have control over infrastructure and IP. In terms of African firms can do things like host servers, code bases, and AI models locally, controlling population and maximizing. It is literally a software like resource, not necessarily an hardware resource, and like lots of like what's it called, lots of information about how to transition from point A to point B. Operations are already easily accessible on spaces like online and otherwise. Plus two, if you look at it like open source that necessarily exists elsewhere, that necessarily allows you access to necessarily being able to create all of this. What this creates uniquely is that it creates an export dynamics and global demand in terms of how one, there's global demand for this finished product in terms of how Africans in diaspora exist as a market, because Africans are literally migrants in nearly every continent. So it creates large familiar markets for African developed products. But two is that there's unique data advantage. No other country has access to the same African assets, making finished products globally exclusive. But three is that cost and contextual relevance. For key sectors like health, agriculture, and finance, African-made solutions are cheaper, more relevant, and scalable for local and global markets. The impact is that Africa transitions from importing refined solutions to exporting high-value finished products, generating revenue and necessarily pushing economic growth. But secondly, is that you now have first mover advantage that allows African companies to set standards, capture market share, and influence global technology norms. This accelerates development. Africa is now a producer and innovator and not a passive consumer. At best, in terms of their aid, we can necessarily do with aids that come from other places in the state are not used on this particular idea. But beyond that, in the long term, we at the barest minimum give Africa a chance to transition from being people that are dependent on aid to becoming individuals that are able to export this particular stuff. That's how you move from being developing to being developed. Only CG. Yeah.
I have a favor to ask. My partner just stepped out to use himself. I would appreciate if I wait for him to come back before I start. He doesn't know what I want to argue. Be fair. Sorry, OG, just to be fair. Please don't badger me. I'm nervous. Like, we have work to do this evening. There's a Thinkers Pub event from here. Like, there's literally like Thinkers Pub people are waiting for us at the hotel. So, both supposed don't be around, but also like tell me, yeah, but just all right. I think that all of closing government's biggest impacts assume that the risk of data exploitation is unique to aid-based negotiations, right? I'm going to show you why that is not. I think that both teams spend a lot of time talking about the risk that exists. Opening opposition does an excellent job, right, in showing you how refusing this aid leads to net negative outcomes for African countries. The extensions are going to show you that this aid-based data is not just that. It's going to lead to net positive outcomes in ensuring like maximization of their realities. First extension, we want to frame the risk. We think that most African countries are already deeply embedded in data ecosystems through fintechs, social media like Meta, cloud infrastructure. It means that already consuming and mining and maximizing their data on multiple levels, right? It means that things like like this data is already collected here and transferred abroad. Well, why is why our world is better, right? Is that when we have these kinds of negotiations, we have the ability to participate in conversations around how it is done. Actors collecting and mining this data. If they say that there is a danger with collection of data, then they need to cut themselves off from all of global participation in the use of their data. But we think that the harms that they talk about are assume the worst case scenario where every aid provider that this is real, is meaningful and impactful. They will give you this money, it means something to you, versus the one chance that the use of this data for these people is the extreme worst case scenario of bad actors. Second extension. We think that the reality, and this is where this debate gets funny, the reality is that most African countries currently don't collect data. They don't have any rigid data collection or governance systems around their data that they even need to protect, like they argue for, right? It means that data collection is currently fragmented. Things like health records are still paper-based or incomplete in large parts of the of the continent, right? National statistics we've not had the national census in a long time, right? It means that most times this data does not even exist. It is this aid agreements that creates the platform for us to now even go and set up structures to now go and start collecting the data for the first time. The reason why this is net positive for African countries is that for them to come, right, for us to be able to do these things, it means that these foreign partners now have to work with us to digitize our analog old records. They have to train local personnel to be able to manage these kinds of things. They have to create interoperable databases that allow the data sharing to occur. All of these things mean that by virtue of these collaborations, we finally build the capacity to have the data that Ebube tells you we are going to use to cure cancer or cure COVID and all of those kinds of things. Their world does not even have that data in the first place. It is our situation that creates the environment for this data collection to even happen in the first instance. We think that even if there is a future where Africa begins to build the capacity to be able to solve all of these problems like they say, it has to rest on the foundation of a culture of tracking and collecting data that most African countries do not even already have. The harm is minimal. You cannot say that these people are stealing a valuable resource from you when you're not even keeping or storing that supposed valuable resource. Third extension, what kind of data do we usually share? Mascot already told you that it's things like around like context, aggregated data around sectors, those kinds of things, but it's also data that relates to the impact that the aid they provided is making. This is why it is important. We think that the lack of data, like we've mechanized in previous extension, is not neutral. What it leads to is arbitrary allocation of aid funds. He has already framed that corruption is a big problem in these countries, right? It means that we've already seen people receive aid funds and use them very indiscriminately. Because we have set up the foundation for the collection and tracking of data around the programs that this aid fund, we set a foundation that keeps them accountable. But they now have foreign partners that they have to report to on what impact the funds that they provided are ultimately making in the country, like within the countries, right? This is why it is important. In a world where this does not happen, funds are going to be diverted without tracking and diversion. It already happens to the country. We cannot verify the outcomes and impact of this. When he says that because of corruption, the aid is not going to materialize, that happens in our world. But more importantly, there's going to be more misrepresentation of the value of this. In our world, we're able to enforce scrutiny in three ways. First, we're able to document and track where this money goes, the impact it makes, and all of those things are general data that actually end up being a net negative in the sense that it creates a more enforceable accountability life cycle for the aid that we get in the first instance. But then we think that the alternative is worse. The alternative is reality, where countries are bad at collecting data, where actors are corrupt, and where they are unable to track how the programs that they invest in perform. Fourth extension. And this is the extension that responds to his ability for Africa to be able to build local capacity to build technology. Remember first extension. I tell you that most of our technology and health, infrastructure today relies on global Western actors, right? It means that everything from oil production, refining, even though we've had oil for 40 years, we still rely on foreign actors for most of our technology, right? As a result of this, it means that regardless of if we do this or not, we do not have, it is not a choice between this or that. We must rely on global partners for us to be able to have any meaningful participation within the global economy, right? In their world, what is more likely to happen is that we still rely on these things, but like he says, we rely on them with foreign data and foreign context and all of those kinds of things. But this is where we make the difference on what capacity local actors have today. When you think of the most successful technology ventures in this country, when you think of Paystack, regardless of all of the technology advancements that Paystack has made and sold to Stripe, they are still unable to do cross-border payments, right? If you use a Paystack link to try to pay for something in the US, with a US card, it's going to decline it. Means that unless we're able to plug into global data and interconnect in that way, our data is still not going to be functional for us. So if we build national local capacity, but we're unable to interact with the rest of the world through it, like forex operations, export and those kinds of things, it means that at the end of the day, that data is not particularly valuable to us. The debate is not about whether there are some harms or benefits of not accepting this aid. It is that the only time we can maximize aid and create the largest playing ground for us to be able to maximize our potential as a state is when we set database structures that allow us to stay accountable to the people who provide us with aid, but more importantly, to even be accountable to the people who are going to be using the aid on in terms of how we track them. But all of the risks they talk about assume that aid is the only place where these harms occur. They should go and close their Meta accounts. Are you? Okay.
This easy. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
what's the ones I talked about.
Okay.
Just
Okay. 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 Thank you, guys. And I'll begin in 3, 2, and 1. So panel, what I'm going to do within my first 2 minutes would most likely take out Raymond, and because he's just being intellectually dishonest. Data is analyzed and it's put into systems fundamentally, and the existence of automated platforms in the world we live in has made it even easier for things like marketing automation, analyzing of data, and doing things well. But also in a world that has become extremely global in and of itself, what it necessarily means is that within Nigeria, essentially, we have individuals that build those systems that they talk about. Many startups in the United States today employ individuals from here for cheap talents to build cloud softwares, to build automated softwares, to build websites in and of themselves, to build very strong social media platforms. So when Raymond, who is even one of those talents, or maybe used to be one of those talents, then claims that we can't have talents within our country to build structures, especially in a world where building structures within the internet have become inherently easier with the existence of artificial intelligence, he then becomes extremely intellectually dishonest and doesn't even respect your intelligence in the first place. But then what does that mean essentially? It means that it shows that we have growing talents within our countries, and it means that we are not also leveraging those growing talents, because the reason why we don't have those systems is not because the government cannot find those people, it's because there is no incentive to find those people in the first place. So by the time we stop selling those data for human whatever, it gives that better impact, because then we're able to leverage our citizens for something as essential as data analytics, as creating cloud softwares, as creating systems, which is the most important thing in the world we live in today, which then means we can essentially compete in the global market. But what people need the most is this. And then you talk of brain drain. Why do people leave to outside the country? Because jobs like this do not exist within. When they study computer science, when they study computer engineering and stuff like that, when the government leverages on this, we have it more within our world. But what happens when we have our own systems? And which is what ABB explains to you today. I work in business development, and everything I use for lead generation are foreign softwares essentially. But those foreign software have our data. It is difficult for a Nigerian data analyst or data collector to get pure data from Nigeria without getting it from foreign organizations. What happens when you sell your data for benefits is that they have it within their locked systems, and they can sell it to different companies within their states. So it means it essentially becomes difficult for people within to get those things. So even on a principal basis within our world, it is very terrible that you don't give your people access to some of the most important things. It's like having your oil wells 90% owned by foreigners. It doesn't make any sense. And in the oil boom, that did not happen. And the reason a lot of people got economic relief within the oil boom in Nigeria is because people within those states and those Nigeria and Africa, those states and those countries where oil fundamentally existed, had access to invest in oil. We don't have access to invest in AI and everything that has to do with data in a data-driven economy like Nigeria, which is fundamentally bad. This creates a better impact than them because all they say in their case, people will have access to our election data and etc. It's very important that what we've done here, because it's just also shown how essentially we can use the data, because that's one question OG did not answer in today's debate. How can we then leverage those data when eventually we don't sell it out to these people? We've answered those questions and it wins entirely because they lie that we don't have those systems and we have to bring those people in. But even if we have to bring those people in, they're here on our terms, they do it on our systems that we control, and they can be paid and go back. So even if you have foreigners in Dangote refinery, it does not mean our petrol is going to the United States. It means they are paid for their work and they generally they'll go back to their side. No. So now, why? Essentially, then let's just engage other things they say in today's debate. Say when government they say, that we cannot use it, and they say, we can use data. We cannot use it because we don't have the ability to refine it. We've just shown you that. Then they say we can also use data that they extract. It's impossible for us to do it, and it kills the entire of the opposition bench because when data is collected, it then becomes their own thing. It means they have paid for it. We have no access or direct access to it unless we have to pay them to give us that data. We think it's peacefully unjustified for you to have something and still end up paying for it, and that's why the likes of the Dangote refinery should exist in the world we live in today. But then essentially, in the vast majority of instances, they could give us watered down stuff. So when companies, health companies, technology companies come to get data, they usually sell it to fellow companies within those states. It means they have to sell something pure that other companies do not need. They now become a direct competition. How do you have a direct competition with a foreign agency for your own data in and of itself? It means that they have no incentive to give us the pure data and everything we need in and of itself. And then why is this then important and ranks us ahead? Because they then agree. They agree that we need the data. They agree we need to refine the data. So if they agree we need the data, we need to refine it, that's no problem to you that we can't have unfettered access to that data. But secondly, we can probably refine it within our world and get the extreme benefits that we need. It means we essentially win because we don't lose. But then shit. I don't care about the fact that we have good local doctors, not translate us having good health care. This is a structural problem. Okay. So first of all, if we don't even have the data within the healthcare system, they won't even come to collect it in the first place. But that thing doesn't even rank because what we're looking for here are the engineers to refine the data, right? I'm showing that we have the intellectual knowledge already to do that refining and give them a finished product, essentially. Yeah. But then they say, funding drives up and everything. One, we think because of the existence of bilateral trade, because of the fact that nobody, they don't want them well. Sorry, guys. To decide not to do anything with Africa means that they will always still give us when we need it. In the best case or in the worst case when we still need money. So essentially that does not fly because they can never totally neglect Africa. So if we say don't take our data doesn't go offshore, it stays within onshore, then they would eventually still trade with us and do things with us. They still need bilateral trades, then they still need concessions, so they still trade with us. They're still a proper important political bloc regardless of what they say. So in the best case where it dries up, and this is where we then win there, we admit only could dry up temporarily, but we think it's a reasonable trade-off for temporary dry up of funding or than like the global and the continuous deploration of the African state and inability to compete with the global state because of how we explain the relevance of data in this world. We win from CG. Okay.
OG, I'll be taking you. I'll take CG actually. Yeah, I don't mind. All right. Okay, guys. Starting my speech in 3, 2, And one, every single Nigerian startup uses Google Cloud to store their data. This Google, the company, exists in the United States, which means already in status quo, there is a massive accessibility of data of Nigerian companies and everything they want to argue. I think the case they are running is based on the assumption that on the alternative, US wouldn't have any data access at all. That is a problem that currently exists in status quo. It is a problem that CO exclusively solves in this round. They don't prove how they do it. We prove how we do it by increasing the extent of interconnectivity and having like Nigerian companies themselves have access to this extent of collaboration, which improves them internally. This is how we win even over our opening. This is how CG is footing this round. Two rebuttals, two rebuttals to CG exclusively. Two rebuttals to CG. The first thing is that I think it just makes no sense to assume that the data given would be exclusive to who it is given to. Two reasons why. The first is that this data exists within the given country, like Nigeria, for example. And for now, please know, this data exists within the given country, like for example, Nigeria. And there can't be a world where Nigeria has data and can't use it internally to the extent that these data pertaining to health are very important. So even if we give it to the US on our side, we still have access to this data. But then the second reason is that such terms are entirely not within negotiation terms, and it's literally an assault on sovereignty to say I have health records and I can't use it just because I'm in negotiation with you. Why this is very, very important, please, why they are putting this round, is that if you buy what I just said, then it means that all of CG's subsequent impacts does not exist to the extent that we still have access to data which co-opts all the benefits that they necessarily argue on their side. What this means is that given the simple logical nature of this trajectory, they are losing the round, given they don't have any exclusivity to their benefits which we have co-opted on CO. The second thing we say is that even if, a big if anyway, even if we want to assume that exclusivity exists in this particular regard, we just don't want to buy into it because it's going to be a lot slower, because African nations currently don't have access to that much infrastructure or capital to actually improve themselves at such pace, especially given the needs that we actually currently have. It's going to be too slow and very likely impossible in that particular regard. If you're right, please.
But secondly, I'm very, very important as well. If they only have access to that market, they will not have a debate. Because for it like this, you have to be like, that system has to be like something that does not get established.
It's just additional, but the idea is not that they don't have access to any extra data. It's just it's just that the margin of data they have access to on our side isn't that much of an important thing to cause all the impacts you're arguing on your side. That is the case from CO. Let's then talk about the clashes. Let's talk about OG and OO. Please, I'll take you. I'm addressing you. The conversation largely is on the protectionism for African states. What OG says is that there's a likelihood that data could be mechanized against you, etc., etc. Two responses is the first, Ray explains to you why, given the amount of data already available on developing countries by these developed states, it means that the harms they claim can't be that effective to the extent where already data exists. If they would have mechanized it, it already would have been mechanized. But then the second response here is that they don't prove why there is the certainty to the negative mechanization of data. You don't prove why it is certain. We prove to you why the benefits on our side and the harms on your side are certain. On a scale of certainty, OG is losing this debate, given all their impacts are at best speculative, given they don't prove that extent of certainty. What then does OO? Let me take a POI, please.
If the global community cares about African data, which is why they access and exploit it, why does China constantly steal imported drugs into our region because of the global poor systems now applying? Why does that particular phenomenon occur? They care so much about our healthcare.
I think that would have happened anyway. It's not because they ask us for aid or anything, guy. Okay, OO argues, I'm going to be comparing with OO now. OO argues why aid is needed for African survival, and on the other hand, they argue why there is a direct harm on the likelihood of getting access to aid because you win the relationships. Why do we win them? Three things. First is that we argue an internalized structure that achieves the most important impact in this debate. We proved to you why developing countries themselves are likely to have better data collection mechanism, which is the premise for co-opting CG's entire impact on one hand, and also for co-opting OO's entire impact to be devoid of the major criticism that CG gave to OO, which is the fact that Africans are excluded from mechanisms that actually have them control their data. We mechanize to you, from member, while we have the better, given the interconnectivity that exists, we have better access to mechanisms that actually help us personally and internally collect our data, improve our data collection systems, and therefore co-opt OO and CG. Given we have proven to you why on our side they still get their benefits and of course OG's benefits, there's no world in which any of them is winning us. Second thing, reason why we are winning over OO is that we prove also why all the OO impact materializes when we talk about the accountability for states. Because what OO says is that, oh, we need aid. We are going to die without aid. We need all these internal systems to be good. It is not going to be impactful if we don't prove to you why there are mechanisms by which the government control these funds, are held accountable, and are promised to actually do what they're meant to do with those aid. That is also where we win them, on the certainty of the impacts that they necessarily argue. To the extent we will prove to you why the terms of the negotiations in this particular regard, the terms of the negotiations in this particular regard are going to entail mechanisms that hold these governments accountable, which means on our side, the impacts are just a lot more certain and a lot more likely in that particular regard. Third thing then, why we win them, is we prove why technological interconnectivity is only possible with such data sharing and data collection mechanisms actually existing. Ray proves this. This means that we prove to you why talent that exists internally in our countries gain the scalability that they necessarily deserve. We don't say that, we just think that talent exists, obviously. The only mechanism which give talent the opportunity it needs to actually scale and to actually utilize and mechanize existing.